Last year, I made it a point to branch out of my comfort zone of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons to try out as many new TTRPG systems as my schedule would allow for. It's a journey I plan on continuing this year, with games like Dragonbane, Daggerheart, and Draw Steel now in my queue, with of course giving myself permission to get distracted by other systems that pique my interest as the year goes on. However, before I get into those other alternative systems, my attention has recently been shifted back to D&D, and its latest edition, the recently christened 5.5. Even though I covered 5.5's playtest, release, and even used its SRD to develop my own system, Swiftguard, I never really got to see the rules played in a closed environment, where we play a campaign just using the new rules and no legacy content. Which got me really thinking about the greatest strength of 5th edition, that being its role as a gateway system to convert players that previously hadn't played TTRPGs to at least giving the medium a try. Hi, I'm John, this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming, and today, as weird as it sounds, I'm actually going to be revisiting D&D 5.5. Let's get into it. Well, we can spend all day arguing over its merits and flaws. The one thing we can definitively say about Dungeons & Dragons is that it's the most recognizable TTRPG system. Between its depictions in mainstream media, from its movie to live play streaming, D&D and the whole TTRPG hobby is more popular than it's ever been. While I'm sure there are exceptions, I'd go out on a limb to say that for most people, D&D was probably their first exposure to this medium of gaming. Now, over the years, this has been a frequent topic of discussion I've had with many other game masters, much to their lament. Whether it's because D&D has unnecessarily complicated rules, or that there's been problematic content in old products, or even more recent products, or simple disdain for Hasbro's business practices, many game masters are trying to champion other systems as the gateway into the hobby. And while I often agree with a lot of their technical arguments, it is kind of undeniable that D&D is the TTRPG that holds the greatest weight as a household name. I mean, even my grandma knew what D&D was after watching an episode of Young Sheldon. Of all the game systems, I think the way it's been depicted in modern media has done the best to convey what playing a TTRPG is actually like, to remove the barrier for entry for casual players that just want to give it a try. Now, I've had some people say, but John, wouldn't a rules light game make more sense on that front? I think that's a fairly intuitive argument. If there are less rules to worry about, then there's less to get in the way of the players jumping into the action. After all, there are several testimonials of rules specificity in systems like D&D, kind of taking the wind out of a player's sails, and restricting their freedom to the point that they get taken out of the game. And yet, in the case of 5th edition D&D in particular, and I'm talking about my experience with the 2014 rules, that rules structure has more often than not actually been a plus rather than a minus. I've been at tables where DMs try to introduce new players with rules light systems, and more than anything, I've seen that the kind of blank canvas that gets created causes more decision paralysis than necessarily player freedom. Once players are kind of used to what's allowed and not allowed in a TTRPG, I feel that rules light systems give experienced players and GMs permission to build the story they want. But when you're first learning, it is kind of comforting to know what the right rules are for certain personalities. Although it's restrictive, what D&D's class structure does do is present expected archetypes, whether it's the fighter's direct attacks, or the wizard's clever spellcasting, or the cleric being the mom of the party, making sure everyone is healed and buffed and ready to go into battle. I think the balance that 5th edition struck really well was having enough rules to ease some players' anxiety, while not being so crunchy that players can't close their jaw around them. And I think ultimately that's kind of my point with this section of this video. A lot of TTRPG enthusiasts that I know get really excited about technical differences between different game systems. They love discussing the difference between a D20 system versus a D100 roll under system versus Dagger Heart's 2D12 hope and fear dice. But the reality is, new players oftentimes don't really care about that. They like the idea that their choices aren't bound by pre-written code like an open world video game, and that their choices could be affected by a die roll that they couldn't expect. They don't really care about the technical details, they care about the idea of the feeling that the experience is going to give them. So that being said, as I start revisiting D&D 5.5, I'm going to really look at it through two lenses. First, how easy is it for a brand new TTRPG player with no prior experience to pick up the rules and have fun with the system? And second, how easy is it for maybe an experienced player to start picking up DMing relative to 5th edition? With that in mind, let's dive into the weeds a little. Okay, so for some context, at one point it was my paid job to introduce new players to TTRPGs through 5th edition D&D. To this day, my favorite introductory adventure is still Lost Mine of Phandelver from the original D&D 2014 starter set. So when a few friends expressed interest in getting a little D&D group together with a 1-hour weekly campaign, I decided to run Lost Mine to introduce two players that had never played TTRPGs before to this game. Like I said in the intro, I'd never really gotten a chance to see 5.5 work as a closed system. I'd been a part of games before where there was a mix of legacy and new rules, with us kind of cherry picking rules we liked from one edition versus the other. But again, to really get a sense of the balance, I kind of wanted to see what it was like if we just used the new player's handbook. The other thing I wanted to take a look at was the claim that all of the old adventures were backwards compatible as is, which was one of the reasons I really wanted to run Lost Mine. With the new beefed up monster stat blocks, I wanted to see if it was just as good a tutorial experience. At session 0, two of the biggest standout changes showed up immediately, and those were species and origin feats. While D&D 5.5 retains a lot of the classic iconic fantasy species from 5th edition, like dwarves, elves, and gnomes, the addition of Goliaths and Aasimar really got a lot of oohs and ahs, with one of my new players latching on to Aasimar almost immediately. I find new players really do get drawn to game content that kind of attaches them to otherworldly supernatural entities, which is one reason I think a lot of new players find themselves drawn to Warlock. That backstory has some built-in drama that gives them something to build off of. So it was interesting to see that one of the new players really went for Aasimar because it served a similar kind of story, just through the species rather than character class. As many of us know, the new origin feats provide an additional wrinkle to first level characters that can make the build a little more interesting. My other new player really just kind of wanted to be an elf, and his idea was he just wanted to be kind of a fast weapon user that also had some magic. Now, because he was a new player, I wanted to give him a little bit of taste of what all these different options might have, so that as he leveled up, he could be a little more informed about what parts of the game he liked versus what parts he didn't. So together, we built a first level rogue with an equipment loadout that would help trigger sneak attack, as well as taking the magic initiate wizard feat to give him the shield spell and a couple of attack cantrips. And from there, I really just kind of wanted to see which one he would gravitate to more, and then we could decide whether his build needed to be adjusted or where his level up should point him to. I will say one of my criticisms of the 5.5 player's handbook is how backgrounds are handled. I hate how they have these locked in concepts with an obvious but not really sanctioned way to customize them. Rather than have players go through backgrounds, I just showed them the menu of origin feats and just had them apply their ability score increases a little more freely, which also really highlighted how antiquated ability scores are as a concept. Like, we really could just use the modifiers. All the calculations you get, or all the prerequisites you would get from ability scores, really can be just handled by modifiers. That's part of what I did with Swiftguard. It works perfectly well. But yeah, even with this new group, I couldn't stomach making them pick one of the preloaded backgrounds. And I think their characters are better off for it. Now, to clarify a little bit, our gaming group has 6 players, 2 of which are completely new to TTRPGs, 3 of which are very experienced in 5th edition, but new to the 5.5 rules. Especially once the characters hit level 3 and everyone unlocked their subclasses, something that really stood out is there aren't really any quote-unquote trash subclasses anymore. Some classes are obviously more powerful or more useful than others, but when I was a GM for the 2014 Player's Handbook, I'd often find myself saying things like, no, just don't take the Berserker subclass. It's gonna be bad for your character. Or, you probably don't really want to build a nature cleric. If you want a nature character, you probably want to just go druid. And while some may say that I'm taking agency away from my players, again, this is from paid experiences. Players that tended to take those subclasses that I wouldn't warn would end up being really disappointed with their character because the mechanics just didn't fulfill the story promise made by those subclass descriptions. Contrast this to the new player's handbook. One of my new players wanted to be a Beastmaster Ranger. In ye olden times, I would have said no, and maybe we would have even done some homebrew thing. And although Beastmaster is kind of a complicated subclass, because we agreed that I could help her with all the mechanical side of it and she could just basically tell me what she wanted to do, I was a lot more confident in just letting her pick the one that made the most sense for her character because the mechanics at least aren't so way out of whack that it was going to cause problems when they came up. Of course, one of my new favorite rules that came up almost right away is how unarmed strikes are handled in 5.5. In 2014, there were ways to grapple and shove by replacing some of your attacks, but now those two options are alternatives to unarmed strikes. One of my more experienced players that hadn't really been keeping up with 5.5 decided to try out a monk, and she was pleasantly surprised with the new D6 damage die and the fact that her bonus action could be used to grapple, trip, or shove. Monks aren't the strongest class in the new edition, but at least they mechanically fulfill the class's narrative promise. For the most part, I've been finding that the 5.5 rules are better organized, better streamlined, and better balanced. That being said, it's not without its own bumps in the road. Like I said before, I think ability scores are antiquated. Just trying to explain how to distribute ability scores, then add to them, then get a modifier out of them, then use that modifier to calculate everything. It just made session 0 drag on for probably another 20 minutes than it should have. One thing I didn't expect myself to be so about is the fact that every class gets its subclass at level 3. Now, when this was first proposed in the D&D 5.5 playtest, I understood where the designers were coming from. A lot of subclass features are really powerful. You kind of, from a teaching perspective, want players to understand how their class works first before adding the additional wrinkle of a specialization. But for classes with a specific story, cleric, sorcerer, and warlock, where their power comes from some sort of external source, it is kind of weird for every cleric to kind of play the same until they hit level 3 and all of a sudden a specific deity gives them an additional spell list. So I would see no problem with letting cleric players, for instance, pick whoever their deity is going to be at level 1 and giving them those first level extra spells. You know, if they're going to play a light cleric, give them Burning Hands. Or if they're going to play a war cleric, give them like Shield of Faith or whatever one of those spells is. It's nothing that I think is like harmful to the narrative. It's just one less way the players are engaged going into session 1. My biggest gripe, of course, is the new weapon masteries. Now, I don't think weapon masteries are bad. I just think as an overall design, if I were to grade them, I might give them like a C+ or a B-. They're passable. They're not too much of a problem. they are kind of a weird extra thing to throw at players at level 1. And their usefulness is just kind of all over the place. So for example, if you have a character with a longbow, they get the slow property, which of course is an extra thing for the GM to keep track of. I'd often forget if my characters were slowed, but also a lot of times they wouldn't be moving anyway because a lot of the more melee characters would just rush in. So the bad guys really wouldn't get a chance to move around at all, so you wouldn't even notice the weapon mastery. Versus something like Vex, which now gives the rogue an additional way to trigger their own sneak attack. It's practically character defining. Or Nick, which again, one of my players, the Aasimar, decided to pick Ranger. So while the other characters are struggling to hit with a d6 plus modifier damage, she's being able to hit twice with her 2-weapon fighting. She's able to Hunter's Mark. At low levels, she's way out damaging everybody else. And I understand this is going to fall off at later levels, but it just seems there's like disproportionate complexity to that character up front in a way that doesn't really feel all that balanced. And again, it's not like the end of the world or anything, but you also get these weird pieces of complexity where the ranger now starts with a scimitar and a short sword, so you can potentially use 2 different weapon masteries if you decide to go the 2-weapon fighting route. But yeah, weapon masteries just add this one more thing to manage at a low level where new players are honestly just trying to figure out the difference between a D20 and a D12. And I can see a lot of game masters getting caught up in all the technicalities, trying to explain it most precisely, instead of just getting their players to roll the dice and cheering when they get high numbers. Hello, post-recording editor John here. So as I was going through all my thoughts of my experiences with D&D 5.5 with new players, the one thing I forgot to mention until now is just how much I kind of don't like the new character sheet. When I first saw it, I thought it was an interesting idea and something my players had asked me about in terms of creating a new custom character sheet that would be easier for them to fill out, which is bunching all the saving throws and skill proficiencies under the ability that they're paired with. So for example, perception, insight, survival, those are all bunched under wisdom. So basically, if a DM asks you to make a wisdom save or a perception check, you just kind of go to the wisdom block on the sheet. For new players though, because the skills aren't organized alphabetically anymore, it actually takes them a little longer to figure out where the things are. When it came to building characters, it did save a little bit of time in session 0, but again, it just added a lot of time in the at the table utility. Like I've mentioned, I do have a few spell casting characters at my table. One of them is an experienced 5th edition player playing a light cleric, which she has played in the 2014 edition in the past. Again, one of them is a ranger learning spellcasting for the first time. And something about the way the new spellcasting sheet is organized, I understand why, from a design perspective, it looks like it should be easier to track things. For my new players, it's just a little less intuitive to keep track of their total spell slots versus their expended spell slots. I think it's just because everything feels just a little tinier and a little more cluttered. I don't know, this could definitely just be a my table thing. If anything, I would just be curious for your experiences. What are your thoughts on the new character sheet? Do you like the way it's organized? Or have you found that you prefer the old version better? So next, this isn't really a complaint, but it is something you've gotta really pay attention to. It's pretty well known at this point that the monsters in the new monster manual hit really hard. Running Lost Mine of Phandelver, the first combat encounter that the players come across is against 4 goblins, which in the new updated stat blocks would be equal to goblin warriors. When I looked over the stat block before the game, I was like, uh-oh. It doesn't seem like a lot, but the new goblin warriors have 10 hit points instead of 7, and they have ways to get advantage, which then give them an additional D4 die of damage. And for level 1 characters that might only have 9 or 10 hit points, those little bits of D4 damage end up really adding up. So instead, I opted to try to use the same CR budget, but I spent it on goblin minions, which have stat blocks that look much more similar to the old goblins, and my players ended up having a lot of fun fighting them kind of as a tutorial. Now, with Lost Mine, because it's a module I'm so comfortable with, For the first session, instead of having them go to Cragmaw Cave, I decided to have the bugbear just attack them as a boss fight as a follow-up to the first encounter. Well, I didn't really use the bugbear all tactical or anything. I just had him leap down and attack a character. I rolled a nat 20 and just blew up the party druid outright. Like, way past double their hit point max. If this were any other game, they just would have died. Of course, this player was really excited about their character, so I just knocked them to 0 because in any other tier of play, a monster just showing up, hitting them once, would not just evaporate them. And the only reason I had chosen level 1 is because I had new players and I wanted to simplify the mechanics as much as possible. But yeah, pretty much every other combat I've run since then hasn't auto-killed a character, but at least one party member has dropped to 0 in every combat. So yes, the new monsters definitely hit a lot harder. They make combat much more interesting than just showing up to get wailed on by players. And yes, I'm sure there are still plenty of tactics that the players can use to their advantage to optimize combat and still make it way too easy for them, yada yada. But at least for this player group I have, the monsters feel appropriately threatening. Not so overwhelming that combat feels impossible, but yeah, when it's supposed to be kind of a tense encounter, it feels appropriately tense. So if you're planning on introducing new players with 5.5, just know that going in, that you might have to make some calls depending on the player's experience level in case you accidentally evaporate one of their characters. So now I want to touch on the other side of the coin. How friendly is 5.5 to DM? After all, my experience with getting together a D&D group for the very first time meant that me, the DM, was just as new as the players. Now recently, one of the players at my table spoke up and wanted to try DMing themselves. So we switched roles, I built a character, they're DMing for the first time. And as would be expected, even though they're an experienced player, like the one mechanical thing that pops up is weapon masteries. It's just, they're super easy to forget, especially sap, slow, those ones that like inflict a condition. It really isn't anything worse than a cantrip. I mean, Ray of Frost slows, Vicious Mockery is basically sap, but the difference is you're usually only hitting with one cantrip a turn, whereas weapon masteries are one per attack. So especially as you start getting, bonus action attacks or extra attacks, those conditions can really add up against multiple creatures. That being said, this is my chance to really praise the new Dungeon Master's Guide. In the 2014 5th edition, the Dungeon Master's Guide was a pretty good resource if you knew what you were looking at and knew what you were looking for. Unfortunately, that book is famous for not being the best organized, and also really is for experienced dungeon masters to customize their game. It's not a really good how-to guide for how to get into dungeon mastering. The new DMG, on the other hand, has this really neat on-ramp for someone that's never DM'd before to start learning some of the hard and soft skills to gain some confidence right out of the gate, while also giving some tools to keep your game interesting in the long term. One of the things I do like is that, unlike the Player's Handbook or Monster Manual, I don't feel like the new Dungeon Master's Guide replaces the old one. You can reference content from both of them freely, and as you become more comfortable in DMing, you can use those variant rules to customize your particular game to fit you and your players' tastes. Now, to answer the question, how backwards compatible is the system with older adventures? I think it kind of depends on what your expectation is. I thought Lost Mine was at a good challenge for new players already, but it definitely felt tougher than what I was expecting. If Lost Mine was meant to be a little deadlier, then yeah, the new stat blocks definitely fit a lot better than the old ones. The system itself worked just as well. You just have to know that the enemies are gonna hit a little harder. I don't disagree with my fellow GMs that believe that other systems do things better than D&D. However, I think my feelings of D&D are best captured by the thoughts of two D&D Beyond developers that were recently interviewed on Ghostfire Gaming's Eldritch Lorecast. They said when redesigning the website for a new VTT that they imagine their VTT as kind of the Honda Accord of options, that it's not going to be real specialized, there are going to be features that are missing, but it is going to be intuitive and easy to pick up. If I were to keep on this car metaphor, obviously car enthusiasts are going to get excited about specific vehicles and the technical specs and advantages and disadvantages of one over the other. But if you're a new driver, a Honda Accord is a pretty good choice. It's got a gas pedal, brakes, mirrors, turn signals, steering wheel. What else do you really need? So yes, if you're an experienced game master and you're playing with players that want a specific experience, something that's a little more specific may meet your needs better than 5th edition. But for players that have no experience with TTRPGs, I think 5.5 does just about as well a job as 5th edition did. I think that it's got superior subclass balance. I think that makes it a lot easier to say yes to maybe a concept a player is really excited about, but just know that monsters hit a little harder and that weapon masteries are going to be something that might be a little more difficult to pick up for those martial classes. To conclude, players are excited about the idea of TTRPGs, not necessarily their technical specs, until they get converted into being TTRPG enthusiasts. So now I want to hear your thoughts. Do you like the design of D&D 5.5 or do you prefer 5th edition? If recognizability weren't a factor, what system would you want to be the one that most TTRPG players start with? And at your table, what do you find excites your players the most? Do they like the decision making, resource management, background writing, something I haven't even thought of? Let me know in the comments down below. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.